What I did, this is going to be similar to the presentation that was done back in January at the Neurodivergent Lived Experience Summit, if anyone was there. But there were some things that when I first was like putting things together in my mind, like I wanted to do something bigger. And so I've been able to get that taken care of. And so this right here is representative more of like what has been in my brain. I just needed more time to get it all out. So here we go. We are going to talk about the stress response and then somatic release when we don't really know what's going on, because that's my jam. All right. The regular stuff. Hi, I'm Shauna, anti-BMI, anti-BS, certified health coach, personal trainer, all this good stuff. I'm not going to go through this. You can watch it on your own. The legal stuff. This is not medical advice, not mental health advice, not personal health advice. You know, we're just be careful. Safety first. What we're going to talk about, the physiological stress response, how it can show up in the body, using pattern recognition to recognize when you're dysregulated, determining types of somatic release that may be most beneficial, and then the updated body awareness system. Let's go. All right, so the whole thing here is that, and especially if you are an intellectualizer like me, often we try to figure out why we feel a certain way before we move or regulate through it. So it's kind of this idea of our brain versus our body, thinking versus feeling. So the goal is to recognize what's going on in the body first and trying to move through that and then worry about the why or the intellectualized feeling later. So the first thing is kind of like, what is somatic? Because this has become, I don't want to say trendy, but you know, we hear somatic all the time, and it really means of or relating to the body. So when somebody says like that their therapy is rooted in somatic therapy, it's about understanding that the body is going to hold trauma, hold tension. It's going to react in ways that maybe are not connected to the brain, things like that. So really quickly, there is the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And so the autonomic nervous system is what most of us think of with nervous system. That's our involuntary processes like breathing, digestion, heartbeat. And this is made up of our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. On the flip side, we have our somatic nervous system, which is voluntary. So these are things we're actively thinking about the movement and doing it. And they go through different cranial nerves. Keep wanting to hit the space bar. It wasn't until I understood a lot more about what is going on inside of my body when I am stressed out, when my parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, that I was finally starting to be able to connect dots of like, oh, that's why it feels this way here or here. So I want to go through this really quickly because this is important. Hormones in general are complicated. We're just going to look at the stress response hormones. So the hypothalamus, once the amygdala is triggered, the hypothalamus receives that initial distress signal, and this is where the stress hormone starts. So CRH is, I don't want to have to, guys, don't make me. CRH is produced. That takes about like 2 seconds. Then it goes to the pituitary glands, also in the brain, produce ACTH. And then in another like 15 seconds, the adrenal glands are going to go. The adrenal glands are over by our kidneys. So this is where we're going to have adrenaline and cortisol going on, or epinephrine and noradrenaline. Norepinephrine. All together, this takes about 2 minutes from theoretically being triggered to the kidneys secreting cortisol. Should be around 2 minutes. So theoretically, theoretically, we would have about 2 minutes to ideally be able to de-escalate once we recognize that we've been triggered. Now, it's not always going to work that way, but just theoretically. And then the reasons, again, for me, understanding how it was felt in my body was looking at like, oh, this is what is happening when my nervous system is activated, when my sympathetic fight or flight is triggered. So I'm not going to go through this whole list of things, but everything from our sweat glands, like our sweat glands start going, we get sweaty, salivary glands are suppressed, so dry mouth, our airway gets constricted, so we aren't breathing as deeply, our heart rate increases, and then digestive activity slows down, so things like having to go to the bathroom because we can't hold it. So all of these things create this cascade that can show up any number of ways, like dry mouth, again, upset stomach, hot, sweating, even feeling like clammy, you're kind of like, will sweat initially and then it wears off and you're cold, tightness in chest, hard to breathe or catch your breath. And then obviously that physical tension, once it's been there for a while, of holding things in those positions. So then here are some of the things that can impact each of our stress experiences. The first is interoception. This is how we sense internal processes like thirst, hunger, temperature, feelings, and then proprioception, our sense of body positioning. This is one that happens without thinking about it. So there is such thing as conscious proprioception, but this is the stuff that we're not thinking about and don't have a whole lot of control over. So it even includes things like working motor skills. All right, and then here are some of the other things that impact our stress experience. I don't want to say that autism and trauma are the same thing because they're not at all. However, some of the ways that they can impact the brain are similar. And so for the purposes of how our brain and stress response go together, it can be helpful to look at the two of them because there are some similarities in the physiological impacts. I need water. So the first is having a hypersensitive amygdala, which is our stress trigger. We're activated more easily. And then another one is there is an association of a reduced volume hypothalamus, which is kind of like the hub for stress. That's a modulator. This is also involved in interoception. And then they're both associated with an impairment of the basal ganglia, which there's sensory processing and motor control. And then also there are structural differences in the cerebellum, and this is primarily where we see a lot of the differences in proprioception. So that being said, there are also some differences in the somatosensory cortex. So it's a little bit, it can get confusing with interoception, but it's like how we process touch, temperature, pain, and proprioception. So for some people, some autistics have reduced and some have increased. So maybe we don't feel things as much and might need more pressure to feel something or less pressure because we feel it more strongly. And then, yeah, studies also show that trauma can reduce this as well. I should say for most of these things, when it comes to complex trauma, theoretically, the brain is healable to a point where, it used to be before the trauma. Autism is not like that. So that is a primary difference, just to be very, very clear. So yeah, we may have all of these things kind of accumulating and we don't really know it because our experience with stress and what's going on can be very different. So how this can show up in our body, I think looking at muscle close up is really helpful. We have fascia the fascia runs through the muscle. It's that white, sort of looks like lace. It runs throughout our whole bodies. And as tension builds up, it can build in the fascia as well as the muscle, and fascia itself can tighten with trauma. So when we talk about stress release physically, things that have accumulated in our body and we're trying to get rid of, the main goal is usually to kind of warm and lubricate these areas. I always like to think of it as a rubber band that's been put in the freezer. If you take it out, it's gonna be brittle. And if you just give it a little bit, it'll warm up and get nice and malleable. And so that's really what somatic release is. It's movement intended to provide physical tension relief and relaxation to the body first. And this can provide an environment for our parasympathetic nervous system to engage, which should help us, relax and release both physically and theoretically, emotionally as well. And the other thing I should mention is that, one of the big things with somatic release is the body is just looking to feel safe, but it doesn't necessarily, we don't necessarily know what that means. I may not necessarily know, this is exactly what my body needs to feel safe. But once my body's in that state, I know that I feel that way. And so a lot of, at least for me, somatic release is trial and error and figuring out what works for you and where you get the sense of relaxation and safety that your body needs. All right, so let's talk about some ways to do this. Myofascial release is going in and loosening up breaking up all of that tension. So using a trigger point ball, a foam roller, something like that. This stimulates blood flow, helps promote healing of the tissue, all that good stuff. I should also mention water helps, but that's annoying, but it's true. And then there's always stretching. There are 3 types of stretching. There's dynamic, static, and proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, PNF. Dynamic stretching is when we stretch with movement. So if you think about flow yoga, how they're kind of always moving, that's dynamic stretching. Static stretching is holding a pose for a set amount of time, holding it in one position. And PNF stretching is where you use something to create resistance against the stretch. So say this is my leg and I'm trying to stretch my hamstring. Someone or something else is pushing this way and I'm going this way, and we're working against one another to help get a stretch. That is actually a really good one for if you are hypermobile, that and dynamic stretching. Static stretching can be iffy. And then when it comes to, this may seem counterintuitive, but because muscle tension can also be related to weak muscles, for long-term tension release and relief, strengthening can also help. So it can help with growth, repair, and just really keeping things less knotted up. Because really, that's what it does. We break down muscle and repair it when we strengthen. Okay, so some other types of somatic release are, any movement. There's, tapping, like the face tapping, bilateral things, dancing. Think of this as self-regulation. Whatever you need to do to get it out and feel better. However, the focus of this is more on, we're just focusing on muscles and getting that tension relief. So that's not to say that some of these don't do the same thing. For example, if I take a warm shower, that's going to relax my muscles. That is something that is a somatic release method. Singing can warm up the throat muscles. It's about the fact that they warm something up with the muscles, as opposed to, for example, journaling is another somatic release method, but that's not going to get rid of physical tension in the body. Still worthwhile, but just different things. So one of the things that a lot of people it's okay, well, I don't even understand how I feel. I don't understand what's going on with my body. How do I know what to do? And so in my mind, I had started piecing this together as I was going through things myself, and created this like system where the first thing I'm trying to do is recognize what's going on with my body and work my way out from there. Ultimately, trying to connect patterns so that I can prevent certain things from happening if possible, and know what I need to regulate or de-escalate in certain situations, as opposed to having to figure it out because I've already done that. Ideally, I can also connect some of my feelings, and I'm able to actually process through things as opposed to having it sort of like separate, intellectualized. And my body is like, my body's holding tension, my brain's thinking these things, but they never really go out together. This helps with that. So here is the updated, and we're going to focus again on releasing muscular tension. So the first step in the initial, this has always been here, is the body wheel. And it's just kind of taking the overall how stress can feel and working our way out from there. But the point of this wheel is really safety. And that's why the first step for all of these is going to be basically an interoception check, like making sure, have I had water? Have I had food? Is there something, truly unsafe around me that is threatening me? These kinds of things that, because we're so disconnected, it's like, oh, my head hurts. Well, I haven't had water in 7 hours. Doing this check sometimes, just in this very first thing, I can be like, oh, that's my problem. If that's not it, if it's not sort of like an immediate, oh yeah, that worked, you can move out and look at some form of self-regulation, whatever may work for you in the moment. And again, this is where kind of like trial and error. I like to think of this wheel as like my triage wheel. This is kind of like in the moment, right when something's happening. Do I need to move through it? Do I need something immediate? Then here's where I'm excited about this one. What I did was I took the body's stress response, some of the main ones, and then correlated that to some different things that may be happening in our body and some different thoughts or feelings that we may be having. So say I get through this body wheel and I'm like, yeah, or just in general, I've got a lot of like tension in an area, or I feel like I'm not, my breathing has just been like short and shallow lately. This is where I can go in and say, okay, here are some of the things that stress does to my body. So I'm just going to look at like the heart rate, for example. Our heart rate increases with the sympathetic nervous system. So some things that may happen to me, I may feel shaky. I may feel like a little bit lightheaded. I may have that shallow breathing, short, shallow breathing. And then everything that's bolded are areas of the body where we may feel tension. So when my heart rate increases, I may feel tension in my neck, my jaw, my throat, my chest, and my shoulders. Beyond that, I may find myself feeling this way when I feel unimportant, or feel rage, or defeated, or betrayal, or fear. So what I've done is kind of done this for 6 different categories. And you can personalize this with whatever works for you. Like these, the feelings may not at all correlate to your stress response, but it's just something, it's a place to start. I don't know about anybody else, but for me, like it's so much easier for me to take somebody else's paper and edit it and make it work for me than to like start the whole thing myself. So that's what the stress wheel is for, is saying, how is stress affecting my body, maybe in the short term, but also in the long term? Where am I feeling it most? What am I noticing myself? Am I noticing myself, crossing my arms really tightly a lot and crossing my legs really tightly? Do I have hip and low back pain? Have I been feeling, whatever the things are? So this is where I've started trying to connect like all of these different things going on. Then what I did is I created a release wheel. So it's similar to the stress wheel, but the middle section is an area of the body. And then the next row out is muscles. And then the next row out is going to be methods of regulation for that specific area. So instead of just giving you like the wheel, I want to go through each of these categories because we're talking about release in general. So once you go through and you've looked at these and said, okay, here are my areas that are tight, then you can pull up the release wheel and say, it's the front of my neck, my jaw, my throat. Okay, here are the areas of the body that I can look at to focus on for trying to get some relief. What I did not do is give a bunch of specific exercises because I don't know your body and I don't know what's safe for you. But what I wanted to do is give you enough information that you can look this up yourself and you can look up, stretches for the levator scapula and then determine like, this is what's going to work for me. This looks like something I can do, whatever the case may be. And then also just connecting where you may feel it. So here is, and for this one, we're going to go through, there's a whole list of different methods of regulation. So for this, it's going to be like neck and chest stretches, foam rolling, no, not foam rolling. Sorry, guys. I'm moving on to the next one already. Diaphragm breathing, that opens our neck. Things like walking or just any cardiorespiratory activity, anything that gets this area warmed up where you're breathing heavy can be really, really good to help stretch and open up the neck and chest. And then another one of the areas is the chest. So working down, same thing. If your chest is tight, it may be that, you can find some relief from the pectoral muscles here. A lot of people forget about our deltoids. That's the bottom one right here. The sternocleidomastoid is the neck photo that was in both of these. This one runs along. This one is really bad. The intercostal muscles, these are deep, deep inside of our rib cage. If you look those up, I can't show, there are only so many images I can put up here just because of like copyright stuff. So the intercostal muscles are deep in the rib cage. And so when we're breathing real shallow, those muscles get even tighter because we're not stretching them as much. And so by doing the appropriate diaphragm breathing and opening our chest up, we can help loosen these areas. And then same thing with diaphragm breathing. And then another one of the areas is the posterior neck and shoulders. So kind of like working our way down. And what you're going to see is there are similar muscles as we go down because that's body mechanics. So again, you can take this and you can look it up and say, yep, this is where I feel the tension. We have some of these muscles are so deep, again, connected to the vertebrae, to the rib cage. And so when we are just constantly sitting in these tense positions, we have muscles that are so deep inside of our chest and back that for me, I'll often think it's like heartburn when that happens with my chest muscles. So again, just some perspective on how we can get release even just from things like breathing properly. And I know we all talk about the upper trapezius. That's like the big one up here. So again, trigger point, appropriate stretches. Let me pull up actually. Hold on, let me do it. No, we're good. We're good. I think I'm gonna pull it up at the end. And then when it comes to tight shoulders and mid-back, I wanted to separate because there's kind of like neck and shoulders here, but then there's also shoulders, all the way down through like our thoracic spine. And so these are the areas that I would focus on in terms of both trying to get release and also strengthening, because again, oftentimes when these muscles are loosened, like for example, if we're hunched over, some of these muscles on our mid-back are going to actually be too loose because we've stretched them out. And so strengthening can give us more long-term relief in addition to doing something like maybe releasing the upper trapezius with trigger point or stretching. So again, and this is just to show like we have muscles that stretch all the way from the base of the skull down to our pelvis. And so this is why sometimes we can focus on a single area, but sometimes it's like there's all sorts of things going on. And then tight low back. I know this is like everyone's. The big secret about the tight low back is the hamstrings. I want more people to understand tight hamstrings. And if you're hypermobile, you probably still have tight hamstrings. Hamstrings are a big one, so lots of foam rolling, stretching. And then when it comes to the hamstrings, the hip flexors, the hip abductors and adductors, these are groups of muscles. And so in the full like body awareness thing, it lists out the individual muscles so you can look them up and you can figure out, you know, anatomically where you need certain things or where you may feel things. But just in general for here, hip flexors, by the way, that's the front of our leg. It's what pulls our knee toward the stomach. Our hip adductors, this is what pulls our leg away from our midline, or I'm sorry, pulls our leg toward our midline. Abductors pull away. So if we're moving our leg away from midline, we're abducting using outside of our hips essentially and outside of our legs. And when we're pulling in toward the midline, we're using the inside of our legs and the inside, the adductors of the hips. And those are where we get those really, really deep, tight, because they're like inside of our pelvis, very, very deep. And then tight hips, very similar with the addition of the pelvic floor. It's very natural for us to kind of hold up and tense that in when things are going on. And everyone has a pelvic floor, regardless of whatever. So hip openers and deep diaphragm breathing are both really, really good for helping both opening the pelvic floor, but also just learning how to control it, because ultimately you want to be able to do both. Release and contract it. Here's how the wheel actually looks, just so everybody can see it and has an idea. Personalizing it for what actually is going on with your own body. I mean, that's the whole point of this. This is just to give you an idea of some ways things can manifest and some things that can work. So once you've gone through that release wheel, you know, you can use that separately. And then there's also the feel wheel. And I use this all the time, but especially after I have done release, this is helpful to kind of go back and be like, okay, this is how I was feeling. But again, I just use the feel wheel all the time. And then the entire point is to be able to eventually, like I said, kind of figure out different patterns and connections that work for you. Like, I'll give an example. I get a very specific stress headache, and it's not like a stress headache that can be remedied in like an hour. It's one of these things where it accumulates over time, and it's just from like a combination of not drinking enough, not eating enough. Oh yeah, it's the gua sha tool. I'll put it in the chat. Gua sha. So I've started to connect that it's this very specific headache that is an accumulation of like not eating enough, not drinking enough, not moving my body in the ways that I need to. Like I need very specific types of stretching for my neck and shoulders. You know, working on the computer too much, like it's this very specific headache I get when I've just been too hyper focused and not taking care of like my basic needs. And that's something where, because I've done this enough, should I be able to catch it before I get to that point? Yeah, probably. But when I feel the headache, I'm like, oh, you need to slow down. Like you've not been doing these things. Or I can tell I'll get a very specific like tightness in my chest and jaw when I feel like I need to say something to somebody that I haven't been able to say. And I've gotten to a point where I know I can tell like, okay, this is what I need to do. And this is why I feel this way as soon as I feel it, instead of having to like go through a whole process. And some things I just know this works for me to regulate when I feel this way. This works when I feel this way, etc., etc. So this is just about helping provide tools so that you can connect your own patterns. Like we can't improve interoception, or we can't improve unconscious proprioception, but the point is just trying to like compensate for some of what is not so easy. And I think that's kind of the reality, is we just, for most things, we just have to work harder to figure it out. And this is one of those things. Like a lot of people may be able to just process through their emotions super easily and it's no big deal. Well, me, I need like a 5-step system. So this is what I do. Yeah, so that is how I have started to put the pieces together and things that have worked for me. Obviously with release methods that actually work. The next workshop is July 14th. Obviously, I'm not going to do it the first weekend of July because we will all be miserable with headphones on for probably a week straight, avoiding the noises. But yeah, that's it. We'll go through hypermobility, body mechanics, and talk a little bit more specifically about some of the muscles that surround the joints, and how we can strengthen and support ourselves through the better and the not so great days, because there are always both.